Hi everyone, and welcome to our very first webinar. Today we're going to be talking about topics relevant to wildlife protections and biodiversity. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please write them in the chat. We will have a moderator who will read them out loud after the webinar once we're done presenting. And if you would like the PowerPoint or our sources through the slides, just let us know. We could email you after the PowerPoint is done.
All right, so my name is Fallon Hayes, so I'll just be giving us a little bit of a summary about what we'll be talking about today. So I'll be talking about wildlife trade and what exactly it is. Then we'll have Francine talk about the positive and negative aspects of it. The roles played in wildlife trade will be taken by Devanshi. We'll have a case study on the current COVID crisis by Yoko. And then research on public attitudes toward wildlife in Chinese medicine. Caitlin will be talking about this, and that's actually her master's thesis, so that's exciting. And then Laura will be talking about the need for economic changes, and Lisa will close the webinar speaking about what you all can do. Awesome, next. So wildlife trade, what is wildlife trade? So wildlife trade can be defined as the selling or exchanging of wildlife or plant resources. So the exchange of any sort of living organism is considered wildlife trade. So plants are often forgotten in the traditional sense when we speak about wildlife trade, but because they're a little bit less charismatic than their animal counterparts, but it's important to remember them. And wildlife trade is actually the second largest threat to species after habitat destruction. So it provides a significant potential for destruction of species. And then there are two types, legal versus illegal wildlife trade. Next. So why do people participate in wildlife trade? So humans have been participating in wildlife trade since the beginning of time. So some of the main reasons are for food, clothing, medicine, and the desire to acquire unique pets or unique plants. Next. So legal versus illegal wildlife trade, what exactly is the difference between the two? So I just want to say that depending on the country that you live in, the line is kind of blurred. So what is illegal in one country might be legal in another, so this is important to remember. But ideally, legal wildlife trade is the exchange of wildlife in a responsible and a sustainable manner, and in order to maintain healthy ecosystems of targeted species. So for example, in Canada, you need a license or a permit in order to fish or hunt. And what this can actually do is it allows the ministry to understand how many individuals are being removed from the environment and provides information about population dynamics. So it can actually provide a lot of interesting information. Next. So why is legal wildlife trade important? This is a really interesting topic to speak about. So first, it is an important source of food for many communities. So depending on where you live, so for example, if you're living in a remote area, you might not have access to a grocery store, or you might not have the ability to rear your own livestock or grow your own plants. So harvesting these individuals from the environment is your only option. And you can think about this also in the terms of Indigenous and First Nations. They've been sustainably harvesting from the land for generations, so it's very important that we always preserve their rights to participate in wildlife trade. Another interesting one is the role of hunting in environmental stewardship. So often we think of hunting, there's negative connotations with it, but hunters actually have ideally have a very close relationship with the environment. So for example, Ducks Unlimited is 90% funded by hunters and has contributed to thousands of hectares of habitat conservation of wetlands in both the United States and Canada. So within these habitats, you have both species at risk and game species whose habitat is being preserved. So it can actually contribute significantly to the positive effects on all populations. Another aspect to think about is animal welfare. So if an animal is living in the wild, they are not being subject to the conditions that you typically find in factory farms, so they are living a more fulfilling life. So that's an important thing to really think about. And wildlife trade and harvesting wildlife from the environment, when it is done in a sustainable manner, is actually better for the environment than growing or farming meat in a more of the sense we do it right now, because there's less nutrient input, right? We're not putting in all that fertilizer, we're not putting in all that water, because these animals are already naturally growing in the environment. And then again, habitat protection. So by having wildlife trade be a significant economic component, you want to preserve the environment. Next. So illegal wildlife trade is what we typically think of in North America when we think about wildlife trade. So what this is defined as is the exchange of wildlife in an irresponsible or unsustainable manner. So usually with the goal to generate profit from the overexploitation of endangered species, right? So there's no stewardship involved in this type of extraction of wildlife. So it can really hurt species. So some of the most common illegal wildlife traded animals are elephants for ivory, we have pangolins for meat, and ginseng, for example. Yeah, so now Francine will talk a little bit about the positive and negative effects.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be talking a bit about the positive and negative effects and aspects of wildlife trade. So I'm going to start off with the positive aspects. These are often overshadowed because we think so much of illegal trade and it's happening so often that we don't really consider them. So the first one is it could be done in a legal and sustainable manner. So international treaties and laws created by countries can allow individuals to continue to benefit from hunting and trading while still protecting the species and its ecosystem. It could also contribute positively to the economy. So it's estimated that wildlife trade that is legal has a $100 billion euro value in the EU. It could also help control populations. So it could manage species that have overpopulated or the introduction of any harmful invasive species. It is positive when it benefits populations affected by the hunted species, their habitats and ecosystems. So basically, if there's a reason that is going to benefit the environment more than damage it, it could be positive. Lastly, it provides resources for humans. So groups of individuals such as indigenous communities rely on hunting for access to meat. And that's something super important we have to consider because a lot of us are able to go grocery shopping or do something like that, but there are people who rely on hunting mainly to be able to get these resources. So we're going to move on to the negative aspects. So obviously there's a lot, but we're going to condense them a little bit more. So first is overexploitation. As species become more and more in demand, we see an exponential growth in hunting and trading. This has caused a number of species to become extinct or severely endangered. And as Fallon mentioned, pangolins have been the most traded animal in the world. It is estimated that 20 tons of pangolins and their parts are trafficked internationally illegally every year. Secondly, there's an economic factors into play that cause negative aspects. So in 2016, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime released the World Wildlife Crime Report, where they estimated that the value of illegal wildlife trafficking was between 7 billion to 23 billion US dollars per year. So the reason there's so much variance in this number is because there's no actual way to get raw data on how much illegal trade is worth. Lastly, there's zoonosis, which is something very important to consider right now because of the whole COVID-19 pandemic. So animals that are illegally traded do not go through any sort of quarantine or veterinary screenings, meaning that they could carry bacteria or parasites capable of spreading diseases. An example of this is HIV is likely linked to the consumption of non-human primates, such as great apes, which are hunted for food, or SARS-associated coronavirus has been associated with the consumption of small carnivores. I did want to point out that I did get this information from the UNEP Frontiers 2016 report. So that was prior to our current COVID-19 situation. Here's a bit of an example of the negative effects of wildlife trade. So the number of lost rhinos in South Africa went from 13 in 2007 to 1,215 in 2014. That's an increase of more than 9,000%. This is happening because of the increasing demand for rhino horn that is said to have a number of medicinal uses. And rhino horns can go for up to $60,000 per kilogram. So obviously it is economically benefiting a lot of people who want to exploit from that species. So next I'm going to turn it over to Devanshi, who will speak about the role of state and wildlife trade.
Hi everyone, I'm going to talk about the roles played in wildlife trade. So as we already discussed, illegal wildlife trade is a global industry that's up to like 7 to 23 billion value. And it mainly affects the protected species as it leads to rapid unsustainable declines of the species. It affects vulnerable populations as the poachers who belong to poor communities are usually the only ones that get caught, and they leave the real mastermind safe and operational. So, and then it also affects the frontline staff as they risk their lives and often face armed poachers. Governments can increase law enforcement by seizing assets and disrupting crime networks. They can help reduce demand by putting a behavioral change in people through media campaigns that show brutality of illegal wildlife trade, and they can ask people to boycott the products. They can impose strict deterrents like punishments and fines, and they can also honor CITES commitments and support intergovernmental interactions by participating in global network building against illegal wildlife trade. In Canada, Wildlife Enforcement Directorate under the Environment and Climate Change Canada enforces Canadian wildlife legislation. Next. Next, I'm going to be talking about is the roles played by non-governmental organizations. So under the United Nations Environment Program, CITES is an international agreement between governments of 183 countries. Signatory countries have to adhere to CITES commitments. Traffic, again, is a global non-profit. It's allied with WWF, and it's strategically active in wildlife trade hotspots. TRACE investigates wildlife crime through forensics. For example, it can help distinguish a real jaguar skin from a cow skin painted as jaguar through DNA samples. And IFO, which was founded in Canada and now headquartered in US, operates in 40 countries, and IFO has infrastructure to rescue and rehabilitate wildlife affected by the trade. Next. Next, I'm going to talk about his role of conservationists. So conservationists generally work with the government, with academic institutions, or with nonprofits, and they provide on-site data about deforestation, habitat destruction, and wildlife poaching. They also help communities transition away from wildlife poaching into sustainable livelihoods and ultimately help turn poachers into protectors. Role of policy. Stronger policies helps us develop a robust wildlife crime legal framework, and policies aimed towards effective patrolling to stop poaching at site level are most effective to curb wildlife poaching and maximize wildlife protection. Policies can help us strengthen laws against wildlife crimes that enable us to fight corruption and increase transparency in the judicial system. And better policies can also help us build stronger international relations. Next. So next I'm going to talk about his role of enforcement officers. They receive complaints or tips about wildlife crime. They conduct inspections and raids at poaching sites, warehouses, or when shipment is in transit. They enforce laws at customs to curb illegal exports as well as imports. Enforcement officers generally have a network of informers in communities that act as eyes and ears on the ground. If you're interested, you can check out Interpol's Operation Thunderball, through which tens and thousands of animals and animal parts got seized from 109 countries, and that led up to almost 600 arrests. Next. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the need to report wildlife seizures globally. To get an idea, so we need to report global seizures to get an idea about the scale of wildlife trade, such as species of wildlife traded, numbers of animals traded, and particular parts or species, if any. It also helps us take a collective action to know the source, transit, and destination states, since there are chances that origin and destinations are two very different countries or two very different regions. each seizure can help us get information such as origin of shipment, identity of traffickers, transportation, trafficking chain, countries involved, and wildlife species traded. So when aggregated in sufficient volume, seizures have potential to provide important insight about the trade network, just like pixels of an image, as when we see more number of pixels, the image becomes clearer. So now Yoko will talk about the coronavirus.
Hello, I'm Yoko. I will be talking about COVID crisis, as she has mentioned, in China. So this is a nice graphic I found that shows the origin and transmission of the coronavirus. So it's possible, they found that it's possible transmission from animal to human, and likewise that bats pass through pangolins, and they're both interactive with humans. And bats and pangolins are both consumed by humans. It's also possible that it's also from bats, not just pangolins. So how are these transmitted from human to human? It's likely that when humans interact, they through air, so droplets from when talking from human, like is in close interaction, and also for mites. And aerosol, which is unconfirmed, but it's likely the case that also through air, and it's also through toilet, fecal route, and which is why in developing countries it's much more common, but it's also unconfirmed. Next, please. So, as most people might know, it's in the newspaper that coronavirus is likely originated from Huanan seafood market, which is located in Wuhan, in southern China. And actually, most of these people consume wildlife in southern China. It's a culture in southern China more than northern China. And the seafood market has a size of 7 soccer pitches. And it's really large space, and so it's easy to transmit the disease from people to people. So they sell wild animals, wild animal trade such as turtles, wolf pups, civettes, raccoons, and all kind of animals you can think of. Next, please. So this graph shows that most of the wild trade in China is imported to China rather than gathering local animals. Though the wildlife market, the wet market in Huanan, is possibly also from local, because pangolins are not, it's also from China, located in Asia. So this graph shows that the import to China is much higher than export from China between the years 1976 and 2018 for about 40 years. Next. So this graph shows that the seizure of the pangolins in China for 9 to 10 years between 2007 and 2016 has about 75,000 pangolins, and with mostly dead while transporting, and only 2,400 alive, and that's only about less than 25% of the animals transported. And this shows that, so from 2013, the first assessment, to the second assessment in 2019, the pangolins are increasingly endangered, and mostly of these pangolins from Asia, since it's closer to China, and it's also African pangolins are also collected and becoming more endangered. And also most of the Chinese people don't know the status of these pangolins. So that's also a problem. Next. this attitude survey was conducted in between 2004 and 2012, and they wanted to know how the conservation awareness and wildlife consumption was like in China, and it also combats wildlife trade. So it showed this particular study showed that the wildlife consumption has decreased from 31 to 29%, which shows a positive result. And also people think that wildlife should not be consumed from 42 to 52%, a huge 10% jump, which is also a good trend. And it also show that the richer and the more educated people have more wildlife consumption rate. It's also because of the taste they value. And also, and because of this, conservation awareness is a long way to go, since most people don't know the status of the animals they consume and the wildlife trade, because they also don't know what is illegal and what is legal. So there's lots of improvement. And this is basically a summary of the report. And the next will be Kaylin reporting her master's thesis on another wildlife trade in China.
Hi, everybody. I'm Caitlin, and for my master's thesis in international wildlife trade at the University of Kent, I traveled to China in 2018 to find out what the public thought about wildlife use in Chinese medicine. It was actually loosely based on the study in the previous slide that Yoko was talking about. So for mine, I was based in Harbin. It's the capital city of Heilongjiang province in northeastern China. It has over 10 million people in the city, and I was assisted by a local university called Northeast Forestry University. So on the left there, you can see some wonderful ladies taking my survey, and on the right, you can kind of see a view of the city. So I created this survey to find out public attitudes towards the use of wildlife, including the public knowledge of species IDing and the IUCN Red List status. So we randomly selected public areas around the city and did this for 6 weeks. So next slide, please. So what we found that the majority of the public could identify most of the mammal species we gave them, but they could not ID any of the other classes very well. Almost no one knew their status. So if they're endangered, if they're least concern, and that was across all classes of animals. The overall attitude towards wildlife, including with the conservationists I was working with, was that wildlife is needed for medicine, food, and overall health. Therefore, it must be protected. People generally had favorable opinions towards wildlife and were against the illegal wildlife trade. However, many of the public members that we talked to admitted they couldn't identify what were illegal and legal goods. People were generally against farmed wildlife over wild caught, just like in the West, how people prefer wild salmon over farmed due to the health benefits. So overall in this study, we found that people were for the protection of wildlife. However, they did not know how they could make a difference. And it just shows how important science communication is. And with the knowledge comes the power to change the future of the wildlife trade. And that's all from me.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Caitlin. So I am Laura. So I will talk about the economic aspects of wild meat consumption and about the consequences of the possible consequences of COVID-19 on global poverty. I want to bring a nuanced perspective to the livelihoods of the most vulnerable population. So the first topic is, why do people eat wild meat? So in response to conservation and food security concerns, many NGOs have tried to reduce wild meat consumption by providing livelihood alternatives such as new crops or new farming techniques, or alternative protein such as fishing. But some researchers have suggested that these alternative protein projects are failing. So why are they failing? So the reasons is like there are many underlying reasons, but I will only talk about two, which are like availability and or affordability and culture. So as for availability and affordability, in some places it's just cheaper to consume wild meat. So for example, a large scale study comparing 7 countries, Botswana, Kenya, Malawi, Mozambique, Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, found out that in rural areas, affordability was the main reason why people choose to eat wild meat. So in Kenya, it was 130% cheaper, in Zimbabwe, 75%, and in Botswana, 30% cheaper. While it's true that in urban contexts, wild meat consumption is mostly a luxury product, in most urban and poorer households, it is a necessity. Also, culture is another important reason why people consume wild meat. So, in a study in Nigeria, people like researchers find out that people prefer hunting because of tradition linked to festivals or holidays, or simply because cutting meat can be shared and gifted among local people and kin groups. So next, please. So if we do a ban of wild meat, what will happen? So the solution to the problem has to be more than nuanced than just doing a global ban. Indeed, if we do that, millions of people, often the poorest and indigenous communities, will not be allowed to access the only source of animal protein available to them. Indeed, like rural and indigenous communities who harvest meat sustainably, as Fallon has explained, um, not only this is their only source of protein, but they also they have competition from deforestation, biodiversity loss, legal and illegal trade. So we should not increase the risk of malnutrition and hunger to the stressors that they already have. Some of the policy suggestions we have to the issue of wild meat consumption is that, well, there's no other source of protein available. Eating wild meat is a necessity and it should be respected. However, if there's alternative products, and if you live in the city where you can access farm meat, you should try to not consume wild meat, as you don't really need it anymore. So by doing this, we can help conserve wildlife, but also allow communities that really need this meat to access this resource. So next, please. So apart from wild meat consumption, I also ask myself, what will be the impact of COVID-19 on global poverty numbers? So as far as we know to date, there's a few estimates about this, but the International Labor Organization suggests that between 9 and 35 million of new working poor people in developing countries will occur because of the pandemic. And the Food Policy Research Institute estimates that a global slowdown of GDP of 1% will increase poverty for 14 to 22 million people. A new UN study using World Bank data sets estimates that poverty could increase for the first time since 1990, and depending on the poverty line, such increase could reverse 10 years of the progress in poverty reductions. In some areas, it will even bring us to 30 years to the levels that we saw from 30 years ago. So overall, the study estimates that global poverty could rise by 500 million people. While the impact will be felt everywhere, it will be felt increasingly in East Asia, the Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and for the first time since the 1990s in Europe, Central Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. Because this study is very recent, the estimates have limitations. Indeed, many governments in middle income countries are trying to introduce social programs so that the impacts can be mitigated. So what can we do? Overall, we could provide basic healthcare for everyone so that people can access it, and continue working on programs for social protection and that create a safety net. In this way, middle income and low income countries can help to mitigate the effects of COVID-19. If this is not done, we will have a new wave of poverty due to the virus. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa, and I will bring the topic back to our home soil and talk about how you can help preserve our biodiversity from your backyard. Firstly, there are many different apps that are citizen science-based. Next slide. That are citizen science-based, but could help scientists with their research. And some of these apps are iNaturalist, eOceans, eBird, and LITTERATI. Next. First, I will talk a little bit about the most well-known app called iNaturalist. You can help contribute to science simply by going out into your backyard or local park and taking a photo of wildlife, whether it's a plant, a bird, or an insect, then upload the photo onto the app. Our phones these days are so powerful that our photos are actually both geotagged and timestamped, which helps scientists check the number and type of species found in a particular area over time. On top of that, you can join projects such as the City Nature Challenge or Observation in Isolation, or simply by exploring wildlife found in your area so you can better identify them next time you go outside. eOceans works very similarly to iNaturalist, but of course it is more geared toward marine observations. But if you live on the coast, perhaps you would prefer using eOceans instead of iNaturalist, or you can use both. Next, eBird works a little differently as it requires you, next slide. eBird works a little differently as it requires you to have some basic bird identification skills, but currently there is a free eBird course. So simply follow the link on our PowerPoint and the coupon code. Anyhow, for eBird, before you go on a walk or a hike, you simply hit the start checklist button. And as you see and identify birds on your walk, you can hit the add button on your left, and it will record your sightings. This would geotag your sighting and record the number and species sighted at that GPS location. Next. So if you are like me who simply cannot stand seeing litter in nature, you can use the app Litterati to record your cleanup efforts. It works very similarly to iNaturalist in that you simply take a photo on your phone, upload it onto the app, and tag the types of litter. What I really like about Litterati is that it creates a map with numbers of where litter has been picked up. So last year, I was running a cigarette butt litter campaign, and this is a map of what I attained from one of the plazas in my neighborhood. What I actually did was present this data to municipalities to ask for change. Look, not only does this map help to visualize how bad the litter problem is in an area, it actually identifies hotspots for solutions. So what is wrong with these areas of hundreds pieces of litter? Do we need more bins? Do we need better bins so the wind don't blow the trash away? Or do they have to be empty more regularly? Or there is simply a lack of environmental awareness in this demographic? On top of that, you can create challenges for your class or your family to see who finds more litter. Anyhow, I would like to remind everyone that regardless of which app you decide to use, please be safe when you go outside, remain social distance, wear gloves, and clean your hands properly if you do pick up litter. Next. Of course, other than using apps, there are other ways you can get involved. The Canadian Wildlife Federation has a Wild Outside program for youth age 15 to 18, and the Canadian Conservation Corps program for those 18 to 30 to learn about conservation issues and connect with like-minded peers. Currently, the Wild Outside program is still running through webinars, and the Canadian Conservation Corps is still recruiting so they can send out multiple cohorts once the pandemic is over. So please do apply. Another way to get involved in biodiversity work is to become more educated. The Toronto Zoo, Ontario Science Center, and Speak Up for Blue all have great free educational webinars and podcasts regularly. Finally, if you would like to volunteer, Juniverse and Volunteer Canada both have many volunteer opportunities that you can participate in from home. These are just some opportunities that you can get involved in conservation from home. Thank you for listening, and we will now start our Q&A section.
So if you have any questions at this time, you could just write them in the chat. We do have a moderator, and we are more than happy to answer anything for you.